It is an oft-told story, gripping in its details. The beautiful but remote mother who died when Virginia was 13. The father grunting away at his literary labors, inconsolable in his grief. The sexual advances of her half-brothers, George and Gerald Duckworth. The early breakdowns, the rivalry with her sister Vanessa, the marriage to the penniless Jew Leonard, the intense friendships with other women, including lesbian affairs with Rita Sackville West and Ethel Smith, and then her suicide in 1941 at the age of 59. Many people have written about the life of Virginia Woolf. Join us as we dive into research and answer the question, who do we trust to tell the tale of Virginia Woolf's life? Virginia Woolf's parents, Sir Leslie Stephen and Julia Princep Stephen, were both married and widowed prior to marrying each other. They had 4 children together, Vanessa, Thoby, Virginia, and Adrian. And Julia had 3 children with her first husband, George, Gerald, and Stella Duckworth. Leslie also had 1 daughter, Laura, from his first marriage. Here is Sir Leslie Stephen, Virginia Woolf's father. He was said to be an eccentric mountaineer, a distinguished editor, and appalled and enlivened by his children. Virginia Woolf's mother, Julia Princep Stephen, was worshipped by all men. She was said to be selfless, decisive, and the epitome of the angel of the house. Gordon stated that her own mother's performance of Victorian womanhood had been flawless. Virginia, as the angel, was sympathetic, charming, and unselfish. Almost every Victorian household had its angel, and it was Virginia's mother, and then became Virginia. After her parents' death, Woolf stated, "When I came to write, the shadow of her wings fell upon the page. I heard the rustling of her skirts in the room. Now this creature never had any real existence. She had what is more difficult to deal with, an ideal existence, a fictitious existence. She was a dream, a phantom. I turned upon that angel and caught her by the throat. I did my best to kill her. If I had not killed her, she would have killed me as a writer." Vanessa, Virginia Woolf's sister, went on to be a painter and was a major character in Virginia Woolf's life. George Duckworth was one of Virginia Woolf's half-brothers. The other was Gerald Duckworth. Both of these brothers were educated at Cambridge, while her and her sisters were educated at home. In Hermione Lee's book on Virginia Woolf, she discusses how Virginia's writer's life was driven by her wanting to prove herself to her parents, even though they were deceased.
You've written many books on Virginia Woolf. What was your inspiration behind them?
Well, I'm a Virginia Woolf scholar, so a lot of my writing and research revolves around her life, and I feel that she is an individual with a very rich life, and she's a very intriguing individual.
In Virginia Woolf, the impact of childhood and sexual abuse on her life and work, you discuss her family and her sexual abuse. Can you touch on that today?
Well, virtually every male in Virginia's household was very abusive, and all of the women in her family were victims of this abuse. And in Virginia's childhood, both of her half-brothers, George and Gerald, were very abusive towards her.
What was done about the sexual violence?
Very little was done. The stories were often hidden and rationalized when they told the stories of their childhood to themselves and others, and especially in the versions that they wrote after they died.
Well, thank you for shedding some light on the subject today. Hello, Mr. Bell. It's so great to have you here to discuss Virginia Woolf. To open up the conversation, what was your relationship to Virginia?
Well, I'm Vanessa's son, which makes Virginia my aunt. Also, Virginia had an affair with my father, Clive Bell. He was very good friends with Leonard Woolf, Virginia's husband, and Thoby Stephen, Vanessa and Virginia's brother. They were all members of the Bloomsbury group.
You've also written 2 volumes about your Aunt Virginia in which you discuss the effect of her sexual abuse. Can you elaborate more on that?
Well, George certainly had left Virginia with a deep aversion to lust. But perhaps he did no more than inflame a deeper wound and confirm Virginia in her disposition to shrink from the crudities of sex, a disposition which resulted from some profound and perhaps congenial inhibition.
How do you think her sexual abuse impacted her life?
Well, I strongly believe that her sexual abuse led to her breakdowns and bouts of depression.
Thank you.
Thank you. Virginia's work has stated that she was first sexually abused by George at the age of 6 when he lifted her onto the kitchen table. Years later, in 1941, she stated, "I still shiver in shame at the memory."
It is impossible to know what truly happened in Virginia's childhood. I believe that there's a chance she enjoyed the relationship she had with George. However uncontrolled and ill-judged George's actions were, it may have been irresistible to a girl like Virginia because George was very handsome and he had considerate manners and he was a pet of society ladies. It's important to remember that Virginia could have been an accomplice in the abuse and she may have enjoyed it even though she said she didn't. And it's also important to remember that the Stephen family is very rarely regarded as having been dysfunctional or damaging. And I do strongly believe that Virginia was bathed in protective love throughout her childhood.
Conversation with Jean Love and Phyllis Rose.
I wrote the book Woman of Letters, Life of Virginia Woolf. As a literary critic who worked with feminist evaluations of literary females, I found Woolf's work intriguing because a lot of it appears to be sets of made-up stories based on her experiences, not actual experiences. Her stories are more myths than anything. Woolf cannot resist telling a good story, or on the next round, telling it even better.
I wrote Sources of Madness in Art, in which I analyzed primary documents to try and see where her drive to write came from. After my research, I would have to agree with Phyllis. It cannot be determined that the alleged offensive actually took place, nor can it be determined that they did not.
There were subtle discrepancies in the way her encounters with George were described. One entry states, George entered her room one night to plague her with embraces. The light was out, she was almost asleep, and he told her not to turn the light on. She then recalls that episode again, only now she's in bed reading Marius the Epicurean when Duckworth comes in, and he turns the light out. A trivial change, perhaps, but the effect is much more sinister.
Imaginative elaborations of some innocent actions and therefore exemplify Virginia's tendencies to extend and embroider actual events. As Virginia both wanted and liked affection from George, she imagined that he had made erotic advances when he was merely being kind and innocently affectionate. He was trying to be a brother, not a lover.
Exactly, Jean. I couldn't have said it better myself. Throughout her adult life, Virginia Woolf was involved in many different relationships. Her love life was almost as complex as a soap opera, being intimate with a homosexual man, her husband, a female lover, and even her sister, just to name a few. Her past had a huge impact on how she acted and reacted to these relationships. When we examine those relationships through different sources, we can learn a lot about Virginia and what people thought about her. However, we have to keep in mind who is talking and whether or not we can believe a word they say.
Vanessa and Virginia's relationship was debatedly one of the most important relationships in Virginia's life. Vanessa was 2.5 years older than Virginia. Both were educated at home, and they lived together for longer than most sisters do. After their mother died, Vanessa and Virginia were the only women left in their household, so they formed an alliance of sorts. Both Vanessa and Virginia were artistic. Vanessa claimed painting as her own, Virginia writing. Vanessa took sexuality and motherhood, Virginia intellectuality and imagination. Virginia saw no reason at all for marriage as long as she could live with Vanessa. However, Vanessa married at the age of 28, and 5 years later, Virginia married at age 30. Jane Dunn, in A Very Close Conspiracy, writes, "There was no doubting the strength and constancy of Virginia's feelings for Vanessa. There were periods, certainly, when the sisters wrote to each other daily, and intense and mutually exclusive in character. Clive Bell was the interloper, never considered by Virginia not to be good enough for the Stephens, let alone for the Stephen whom she loved most in the world and over whom she felt she had prior claim.
What was my relationship with Virginia? Well, we dated for a while, and we were engaged in 1909 for about a day. So it was an interesting relationship.
Linton? Oh yes, him and Virginia had an odd relationship, but Virginia was good to him. I mean, Linton was a homosexual.
I realized it wasn't the right choice, and Virginia realized this as well. We both decided that we were better off as friends and not lovers.
Did I know Linton was a homosexual when I encouraged their relationship? Yes, I did. I don't feel bad about it. Everything generally worked out romantically in the end. I mean, she was interested in my husband. What was a girl to do?
Linton did not love Virginia. He sent me a letter a few days after his failed proposal in which he talked about his relationship with Virginia, and then he wanted to know if I would propose to her. I still have the letter if you want to hear it. Okay. The day before yesterday, I proposed to Virginia. As I did, I saw that it would be death if she accepted me, and I managed, of course, to get out of it before the end of the conversation.
The worst of it was that the conversations went on. It became more and more obvious that the whole thing was impossible. The lack of understanding was terrific. And how can a virgin be expected to understand? You see, she is her name. If I were either greater or less, I could have done it, and I could have either dominated and soared and at last made her completely mine, or I could have been contented to go over without everything that makes life important. Voila! It was you, as you imagine, an amazing conversation. Her sense was absolute, and at times her supremacy was so great that I quavered. I think there's no doubt whatever that you ought to marry her. You would be great enough, and you'd have the immense advantage of physical desire. I was in terror lest she should kiss me. If you came and proposed, she'd accept. She really, really would.
I actually owe my relationship with Virginia to Linton. Isn't it wonderful? He sent me another letter practically begging me to marry her. Of course, I was enthused by the idea. I wrote back, "Do you think Virginia would have me? Wire me if she accepts. I'll take the next boat home." And it was 2 years later when my relationship with Virginia began.
Yes, I encouraged their relationship, as I said in my letter. Your destiny is clearly marked for you, but will you allow it to work? You must marry Virginia. She's sitting waiting for you. Is there any objection? She's the only woman in the world with sufficient brains. It's a miracle that she should exist. But if you're not careful, you'll lose the opportunity. She's young, wild, inquisitive, discontented, and longing to be in love. I thought they would be perfect together.
While married to Leonard, Virginia engaged in lesbian affairs with women such as Vita Sackville West. After meeting at a dinner party in 1922, they began a work relationship that revolved around their shared interest in writing. In 1925, their friendship blossomed into a sexual affair that lasted several years. Leonard was aware of this affair and did not object because he believed her happiness was of utmost importance. Because of her furious envy over Vita's other lovers, Virginia found herself in multiple other lesbian relationships as well. In a letter to Virginia, Vita wrote, "I am reduced to a thing that wants Virginia. I composed a beautiful letter to you in the sleepless nightmare hours of the night, and it has all gone. I just miss you, in a quite simple, desperate, human way. You, with all your undumb letters, would never write so elementary a phrase as that. Perhaps you wouldn't even feel it, and yet I believe you'll be sensible of a little gap. But you'd clothe it in so exquisite a phrase that it would lose a little of its reality, whereas with me it is quite stark. I miss you even more than I could have believed, and I was prepared to miss you a good deal. So this letter is just really a squeal of pain. It is incredible how essential to me you have become. I suppose you are accustomed to people saying these things. Damn you, spoilt creature. I shan't make you love me any the more by giving myself away like this. But oh, my dear, I can't be clever and standoffish with you. I love you too much for that, too truly. You have no idea how standoffish I can be with people I don't love. I have brought it to a fine art, but you have broken down my defenses, and I don't really resent it.
In one of her last letters to Vida, Virginia wrote, "Look here, Vida. Throw over your man, and we'll go to Hampton Court and dine on the river together and walk in the garden in the moonlight and come home late and have a bottle of wine and get tipsy, and I'll tell you all the things I have in my head, millions, myriads. They won't stir by day, only by dark on the river. Think of that. Throw over your man, I say, and come."
My relationship with Virginia was very complex. Originally, I proposed to her numerous times before she said yes, and she was openly honest about the fact that she was not interested in me the way I was interested in her. She even wrote to me, "As I told you the other day, I feel no physical attraction to you. There are moments when you kissed me the other day was one when I feel no more than a rock." I do believe that she loved me, but that she was just afraid. Obviously, Virginia was in love with me. Whenever we were apart, we wrote to each other. And if you read her letters, her love for me is very obvious.
Even during her last moments, Virginia thought of her husband. In her final farewell, she writes about her feelings for Leonard. "Dearest, I feel certain I am going mad again. I feel we can't go through another of these terrible times, and I shan't recover this time. I begin to hear voices, and I can't concentrate. So I'm doing what seems the best thing to do. You have given me the greatest possible happiness. You have been in every way all that anyone could be. I don't think two people could have been happier till this terrible disease came. I can't fight any longer. I know that I'm spoiling your life, that without me you could work. And you will, I know. You see, I can't even write this properly. I can't read. What I want to say is I owe all the happiness of my life to you. You have been entirely patient with me and incredibly good. I want to say that. Everybody knows it. If anybody could have saved me, it would have been you. Everything has gone from me but the certainty of your goodness. I can't go on spoiling your life any longer. I don't think two people could have been happier than we have been."
Leonetta would say to focus on Virginia Woolf's works of fiction.
Okay. He writes at great length upon the principles of writing a biography, and since he won all these major prizes for his biography of Henry James, he's quite respected in the field. His work is older, though, and he's extremely influenced by Freudian thinking. So, as a Freudian, he's going to assume that any artist will repress or use defense mechanisms and may not even be really in tune with her or himself with the truth of powerful feelings that are not socially acceptable. So he believes that the best piece of evidence we have if we're trying to write the life of a creative person is to look into their creative products. So for Henry James, for instance, it would be the novels. For Sylvia Plath, he'd be looking at the poems, and I would imagine for Virginia Woolf, he would particularly want to look at her novels. And so for a Freudian, the highest form of defense mechanism is sublimation, in which you take your deeply repressed sexual, aggressive urges, whatever, and you craft them into some sort of creative product. And so I would imagine he would say with Woolf, you probably couldn't trust things she actually said because we're always trying to present ourselves and so our self-presentation is to look socially acceptable, but also we often don't fully know ourselves. A Freudian would assume that lots of what's driving our personality has been repressed, and only through years and years of therapy will we get to it. However, if I wrote a poem about something like my stepbrothers, that's what I would trust.
Looking at repeated patterns are clues to what may be going on deeper in the psyche of the author. So I do agree with Edel in that respect, so that we can look at imagery that is happening in the novel, in the text, and looking for those patterns gives us a clue into their anxieties or their psyche. So for instance, into the lighthouse, which repeatedly there are images of the water and the waves and the skull, and those images of drowning, death, suffocation can be read because of their repetition and the accretion of different meanings and more significance every time they're repeated. That becomes a clue for us as critics for what might be going on in the psyche of the individual.
I think that there are a lot of reasons why we can think that Virginia's fiction are reliable. In her novel To the Lighthouse, there are a lot of connections that are clearly made between her life and the characters in the novel. Like Gordon says, the Ramsey family is really an exaggerated depiction of Virginia's own family during her childhood, and her mother, the angel in the house, is depicted by Mrs. Ramsey in the novel. And DeSalvo also writes about how in the novel, Mrs. Ramsey says children never forget what happens in their childhood. This could definitely be Virginia's own voice, reflecting on how she will never forget the abuse that she experienced in her childhood. And in another one of her novels, Between the Acts, one of the characters says it's time for someone to write a new plot, and this is a woman saying this. And this could be another connection between that and her own life, Virginia's own life, because in her time, the narrative that was available to her was one that said women had to be subservient and quiet. There are some reasons why we might say the fiction's not reliable. For instance, some of the things that she writes about imply that she would be an advocate for women's rights, but she was one person that did not support women's right to vote. So we have to think about whether or not what she said in her fiction was a reflection of her real life, and if it wasn't, then maybe we should not rely on that to tell the story of her life.
Some people say you should trust the critics when examining Virginia Woolf's life, and others say her letters or her fiction. Much of the information that most of the critics have on Virginia Woolf came from her letters, diaries, and works of fiction. I personally trust her diaries because they were private, personal space that, to her knowledge, was for her eyes only. She even wrote, "The habit of writing thus for my own eye only is good practice. It loosens the ligaments." Writing in her diaries helped her practice her writing, and the only audience she was intentionally writing to was to her future self.
When looking at the life of Virginia Woolf, it's important to ask ourselves, who do we trust, but also who don't we trust? For example, I would not trust the critics because each of them brings their own bias into their writings. For example, Quentin Bell was Virginia Woolf's nephew, so he may be too close to the situation. And Phyllis Rose, a feminist scholar, may have had events that happened in her life which impact the way that she views Virginia Woolf's. In addition, a lot of biographers use primary sources, such as letters, to build their own arguments. So instead of looking at works that have looked at the primary sources, it makes sense for researchers to go straight to the source, the primary sources.
When analyzing Virginia Woolf's life, it can be difficult to figure out who to trust. Everyone wants to present a specific image of themselves to others, and this image is often very different from the reality. In the case of Virginia Woolf, I believe that we should trust her letters the most. Although she is presenting herself in a certain way, she is doing so with one specific audience in mind. Through her literature, she writes knowing hundreds of people are going to read it and analyze her. She knew there were people reading her journals as well, which could have changed the way she wrote. In letters, since we know the exact audience she was writing to, we can use that to glean new inferences about Virginia. It is in her letters where she truly expresses herself honestly, and if not, in a way that we can more easily figure out compared to her literature. Virginia Woolf's letters and those written about her are all primary documents we can analyze and interpret. Her letters were personal, and Woolf wouldn't have expected anyone other than the recipient of those letters to read them, making those the documents we should trust.
There is no such thing as an objective biography, particularly not in this case.
The details of Virginia Woolf's life may forever be a mystery, but her influence as an iconic literary figure will remain her legacy forevermore.